Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So I recently came across this article that was discussing a recent experiment on how various plants cope in space. And the ISS has run experiments like this for a long time because, frankly, plants can struggle in space due to high radiation, microgravity, crazy temperature fluctuations, frankly, all of the space stuff that we struggle with. But this article was talking about how a certain species of plant did very well in space, like crazy well. And this plant species was not inside the ISS, it was outside the space station. And this plant species still somehow managed to survive and reproduce after being outside in space for a long time. So I had questions. I'm sure you have questions, so let's answer some questions and find out what insane plant species can survive a long time out in space and then just keep growing like it's no big deal. So the Superman plant species that we are talking about today is a type of moss, also known as Physcometrium patens. And moss, as some of you may already know, is a hardy plant species here on Earth. Moss thrives in some of the most extreme environments, from the cold peaks of the Himalayas to the dry, scorched sands of Death Valley. And scientists thought that moss's resilience to adverse conditions could make it an ideal candidate for surviving in the harsh environment of outer space, where temperature, altered gravity, and high radiation exposure push life forms to their limits. But in some findings published in the journal iScience on November 20th, 2025, researchers made a discovery about moss that really pushed the boundaries of what they even thought possible for this plant species. So the spores of this species of moss spent 9 months outside the ISS. They were then returned to our planet 9 months later, and about 80% of these spores were able to still reproduce after they returned to Earth. So that's the big picture. So here's how they went about this whole experiment. First, the researchers tested 3 cell types of the moss from various stages in the moss's reproductive cycle. They found that sporophytes, cell structures that encase spores, showed the greatest stress tolerance when exposed to UV light, freezing, and heat. So then these sporophyte samples were placed outside the ISS in a special exposure facility attached to Japan's Kibu module. These samples lived outside the Kibu module for about 9 months in 2022, and they were then returned to Earth. The study lead author, Tomomichi Fujita, a professor of plant biology at Hokkaido University in Japan, said surprisingly over 80% of the spores survived and many germinated normally. From this study, Fujita and his team developed a model that suggested that moss spores could survive up to 5,600 days in space, which is about 15 years. Which I'm just like, what? What do you mean you can leave moss outside in space for up to 15 years, bring it back to Earth, and it just keeps making more moss? Like, what? What is happening? But back on Earth, Fujita's team found that most of the conditions of living outside the ISS, including the vacuum of space, microgravity, and extreme temperature fluctuations, had a limited impact on the moss spores. Moss is like, it's fine. We're fine. We don't need air or gravity or above freezing conditions to be moss. We're fine. Now, the samples that were affected, that 20%, were the ones that were exposed to light, particularly high energy wavelengths of UV light. Levels of pigments used by the moss for photosynthesis, such as chlorophyll A, were significantly reduced as a result of light damage, which affected later moss growth. But even though some of the moss samples faced damage from exposure to outer space, the moss fared so much better than previous plant samples had under similar experimental conditions. And why, you might be asking? Why is moss so much better at living in outer space than any other plant species? Well, Fujita thinks that the protective spongy casing that surrounds the spores may help defend against UV light and dehydration. Fujita said it absorbs UV radiation and physically and chemically covers the inner spore to prevent damage. This coating is likely an evolutionary adaptation that allowed the group of plants that moss belongs to transition from aquatic to terrestrial plants 500 million years ago. And moss has survived several mass extinction events ever since. And while this all just may seem like an amusing exercise, the resilience of moss has implications for how human beings can survive in space long term. Fujita said the spores' success in space could offer a biological stepping stone for building ecosystems beyond our planet. In the future, he hopes to test other species and better understand how these resilient cells survive such stressful conditions. The other interesting thing about this experiment is that it focused on a much smaller organism, these moss spores, compared to previous experiments. Those other experiments focused mainly on plant crops, but by going smaller and seeing success there, it can actually help us understand how potentially biological organisms can thrive in space. And Fujita reminds us that at the end of the day, this result is really wild. He said most living organisms, including humans, cannot survive even briefly in the vacuum of space. However, the moss spores retained their vitality after 9 months of direct exposure. This provides striking evidence that the life that has evolved on Earth possesses at the cellular level intrinsic mechanisms to endure the conditions of space. Which is a bold statement if you think about it, that at the cellular level, there are intrinsic mechanisms in this organism to survive, even in space. The team also hopes that this moss experiment helps advance research on how extraterrestrial soils can plant growth and inspire more exploration on how mosses could develop agricultural systems in space. And it's so funny too, because like at the end of the day, it's moss, right? Like not perhaps thought of as a particularly remarkable plant, but it's inspiring all this sort of radical rethinking on what is possible for us in space, and it's moss. Fujita said, ultimately, we hope this work opens a new frontier towards constructing ecosystems in extraterrestrial environments, such as the Moon and Mars. I hope that our moss research will serve as a starting point. So what do you guys think? Are you as surprised as I am? I am blown away by this experiment. I'm thinking, if you're a biological organism and you are outside in space for 9 months, whether you're a spore or any size, after 9 months in space, you dead. You super dead. But no, you're not. If you're moss, apparently. I know I remember reading somewhere, I think it's in Iceland, that there is this moss that grows in lava fields. So I know it has this reputation for being extremely hardy, but this is like next level. Who knows where it can lead? It feels like one of those experiments that can spark an idea that might change an approach for how we think about our own sustainability in space. Like taking an aspect that works for one organism and seeing if there's some way that we can adapt that for our own benefit. And we can be very good at that when we want to be. So I suppose we'll see. Okay, that's it for now. I hope you guys think this is interesting. I sort of hesitated about making this video because I'm like, it's moss. No one's gonna think moss is interesting, Marion. But the whole thing I just found so surprising, and there's so many factors about this experiment that I feel could potentially pay off in weird ways. I don't know, I just thought it was super interesting. So I hope you thought it was interesting too. And thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.